Aung San Suu Kyi, Myanmar's elected leader, is under arrest by the military that is supposed to protect the nation. A coup was staged in Myanmar as a new session of parliament was set to open. Ms. Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy party won the general election by a landslide, following which the military seized control and is now back in charge. It has declared a year-long state of emergency and has stated that it will hold a free and fair election once the state of emergency is over. The opposition had demanded a rerun of the election, raising allegations of widespread fraud, but these claims were not backed by the Electoral Commission. Followed by weeks of tension between the armed forces and the government after the army-backed opposition lost the parliamentary elections, the military took over. Power has been handed over to Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. Ms. Suu Kyi, President Win Mint, who is the only person authorized under the Constitution to enact a state of emergency, and other leaders of the National League for Democracy party were arrested in a series of raids. Later, the military also announced that 24 ministers and deputies had been removed and 11 replacements had been named, including in finance, health, the interior and foreign affairs. Demonstrators have taken to streets as they want power restored to the deposed civilian government and freedom for the nation's de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi and her allies. Security forces have been using rubber bullets and tear gas against the anti-coup protesters. Coup leaders have issued decrees that ban gatherings of more than 5 people in the capital and also in the largest and second largest cities of Yangon and Mandalay. The international reaction has been varied. While the UK, EU, Australia and UN have condemned the military takeover, US President Joe Biden has threatened to reinstate sanctions. India has said that it is deeply concerned with this development. But not everyone has reacted in this way, as China blocked a UN Security Council statement condemning the coup. The country, which has previously opposed international intervention in Myanmar, has urged all sides to resolve their differences. One of its news agencies has described the changes as a cabinet reshuffle. Neighbors including Cambodia, Thailand and the Philippines have also described it as an internal matter. There is public anger over a coup so soon after an election in which 70% of voters defied the COVID-19 pandemic to vote so overwhelmingly for Aung San Suu Kyi. Myanmar is back to where its journey began in 1949 when the military took over. Democracies are painful, but they are far better than dictatorships. Hopefully, the world will be able to put enough pressure on them to get back to democracy, and military coup will be a thing of the past. Richa Surod Dalal, Democracy News Live, New Delhi.
Good evening, I'm Rohit Gandhi and you're watching Democracy News Live. Welcome to our show, It Matters. Today, we're doing a show on the recent coup that was staged in Myanmar. It occurred in the aftermath of the general elections held in Southeast Asian country in November 2020, in which Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, won 396 out of the 476 seats in parliament, an even larger margin than the victory in 2015. The military's proxy war, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, won only 33 seats. The army disputed the results, claiming that the voting was fraudulent. The military took over and arrested Aung San Suu Kyi along with hundreds of other members of her democratically elected government. Following this, power was handed over to Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. Since then, tens and thousands of protesters have taken to the streets of Myanmar for the anti-coup demonstrations. The international community has condemned the coup, but China chose to describe it as a cabinet reshuffle and has urged all sides to resolve their differences. Aung San Suu Kyi's detention on charges of importing walkie-talkies is due to expire today. Her lawyer, Hin Maung-zo, could not be reached for comment on what was set to happen. Joining us to discuss this is Manoj Kewalramani. He's an Indian analyst who heads China Studies program and is the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Research Center at the Takshashila Institution, a leading Indian think tank. Also joining us is Ambassador Anil. He's the former ambassador to Jordan, Libya, Malta, and is currently Distinguished Fellow with the Vivekananda International Foundation. Also joining us today is Colonel P K Pillay. He's a research fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Let me start with Manoj first. Manoj, why was this reaction from China? When China reacted to Myanmar like this, is this, they would have anyways reacted to whatever Myanmar would have done, especially what defense would have done? Explain to me the relationship between Myanmar and China and why this reaction.
Right. Hi, Rohit. Thank you so much for having me here for this conversation. Look, I don't think anybody should be surprised with how China has reacted. But what the reaction tells us is that unlike our perceptions of China sort of preferring authoritarianism in other parts of the world, countries, and preferring to deal with authoritarian countries, China's reaction tells us that it is a little bit worried. It's a cautious reaction. It's not necessary that a switch to an army rule in Myanmar is in China's interests. And that sort of ties into what is broadly China's interest, right? China's interest in Myanmar, with which it shares a long border and a border that's filled with tension in some ways because of rebel movements, illegal trade, and so on and so forth, and an area where even Beijing has sort of struggled in some way to keep things under control at different times. There have been times where there has been firing from across the border and there have been sort of shells landing into the Chinese territory. And that's been sort of a source of friction for Beijing. At the same time, there are these rebel groups which Beijing has supported, has even armed, whether at some points in time, willingly, at some points unwillingly, and even today that's a source of tension between the Chinese and the leadership in Myanmar, whether it's the army or whether it was Aung San Suu Kyi. So there is this sort of relationship which is very strong and positive because of the proximity, because of history, because of economics, and because of Myanmar's history and its isolation during the rule of the military junta. And subsequently, even though they transitioned to democracy, the approach that the Chinese took was one of adaptability. So that's also meant that the economic relationship since then has even deepened, although most would have thought that a democratic transition in Myanmar would have opened it up in some way to the West and to India. That in some ways didn't necessarily take place, and part of the reason for that is the Rohingya issue that took place in 2017, which again turned the world against Myanmar, and Aung San Suu Kyi sort of drifted more into Beijing's orbit. So I'd sort of look at the relationship as something which is deep yet filled with tensions. There are greater and deeper dimensions today which are security related and economics related. As Beijing has grown stronger, it has looked at Myanmar as a vent, as an opening to secure access to the Indian Ocean, and therefore we are seeing investments in ports. Therefore, we are seeing oil pipelines being developed, and that's also facilitated development in that country, along with creating social frictions. So it's a difficult, tenuous relationship. What Beijing desires most in Myanmar, like it desires most in most of its periphery, is stability. Stability is very different from peace. So Beijing doesn't mind the lack of peace. What it minds is lack of stability, particularly when you're committing some $22 billion over a period of a couple of years of development money in Myanmar, when Chinese conglomerates are involved, interests are involved. So the key is that, and the takeover of the military creates for stability, because you've seen already, and as your report talked about, social frictions. There are protests. There have been protests in the past also. There are currently protests going on outside the Chinese embassy, where people are asking Beijing to criticize and condemn the coup, which it has not done. And it's not the desires to be cautious. Yet, like your report said, Beijing initially created hurdles with regard to the UN Security Council resolution. But then there was a statement that was released by the UN Security Council, to which Beijing signed on to, and which condemned the coup without calling it a coup. Spoke about the need for the process of democratic transition to continue. So it's a fine balancing act even from China's view, and that's what we're seeing playing out.
And that was a very interesting bit, the way China played that out. Even though it blocked the initial hiccups, the blocking, but when the statement was made, it kind of played along. Now, when it comes to China, it's obviously a very interesting bit. Let me extrapolate that a bit. Now, Burma sits on literally the cusp of India and China. And a good, solid relationship with Burma also then begins to weigh in on India, because the Chinese Burmese relationship pressurizes India to do more for Burma. And, we recently saw India give a submarine to Myanmar. It also, committed a lot of the vaccinations for COVID-19 to Myanmar. And so that outreach of India has continued to go on. It's been able to strike that balance between India and China in some ways, but obviously China has been putting in a far greater amount of money into Burma. Now, Ambassador Trigunayat, explain to me, when India commits all of these resources and then China commits all of these resources, explain to me, how does the junta, the military dictatorship, get stronger and Aung San Suu Kyi, the democratic leader, gets weaker with this? So, but one would have thought, because of her striking the balance, she should have been in a place where she could have managed both and continued to go on with her democratically elected government.
You rightly mentioned, I mean, in our neighborhood, we obviously have this kind of a competition for geopolitical influence, I would say, between China and India, and which is very much there. India considers Myanmar as a very close partner, a partner for its connectivity to East Asia, which is extremely important. That's why we are working on this trilateral highway, Chitwa Airport, and several other developmental projects which are going on very well. But we have to realize that the internal situation or the domestic situation, political situation in the nascent democracy that Myanmar is, that Aung San Suu Kyi and her government was basically cohabiting with the military rulers. I mean, and they own or they take about 3 or 4 key ministries which deal with the security matters, defense and all others, and therefore there's a very fine balance that one makes about it. India's position has been very clear that they are concerned exactly what has happened. So we naturally are very worried about this, because we have uh, counterterrorism cooperation, the defense cooperation, as you mentioned about the submarine, and many other areas in which we have invested a huge amount of money in, or continuing to do so, including in the Rakhine state. And so for us, it is extremely important that the democracy returns. And India has been working behind the scenes at the UNSC and has been trying to work out some kind of situation. But I believe that right now, although military junta has taken, and we know the reasons for that, because there were problems between them, the political leadership and the military leadership, and they did not like the results that came out, and this has become sort of a given nowadays. When the results you don't like it, you go and try to sabotage the whole thing. So that is probably happening in this place. But I don't think that the military really calibrated its move as to what kind of repercussion it will have now. For example, there is a tremendous movement that is taking place in the country against the coup or against the takeover by the military. They want the people to be released. They want Aung Suu Kyi to be released and the power to be handed over. They don't like this situation, and that is the kind of thing that has happened. I believe that not to this level it has happened, and it is happening in different countries as well. So what the army definitely is under a lot of pressure, and as Manoj mentioned before that, the Chinese actually, in my view, were caught unawares about this, even though their foreign minister had visited in January. We also, as far as we are concerned, is we have created a good with seeing the kind of politics prevails there. We also developed military to military ties quite strongly. General Lang has also come to India, and in fact, all his other 2 or 3 colleagues, at the senior level, they had also come to India, and we have been training them, and we have been trying to help. So India does have a certain leeway, I believe, with them, and so, but you cannot pressurize at the moment. You have to see how the situation really develops. But for the time being, India is working closely and watching what is happening, as the ministry's statement said, that they're monitoring the situation. But I think the more action is happening, in New York.
Right. I think, Ambassador Trigunayat, you make a very fine point of India's fine balance. Now, last week, when the military took over, 40 Chin rebel families asked for asylum from India. Now, you have to remember where Myanmar is egged. It edges on Mizoram, Manipur. Now, these are border states in the northeast of India. The Chin rebels have been operating on the Myanmarese side, but they obviously have been between India and Myanmar for a long time. They've been fighting the junta earlier, and now they're coming back again to tell the Indian state, please give us asylum, because when the junta takes over, they will literally massacre the Chin rebels. They aren't a very large grouping. But junta in Myanmar, if there is no control on how it's operating, then a lot of the groups from India, separatist groups, land up operating from Myanmar, and it has happened in the past. Explain to me, Colonel P K Pillay, you've worked in the northeast of India, you've had a large military role to play there, and you've worked and you understand the landscape in Manipur and the border areas. Explain to me, how sensitive is it for India's northeast, for a shaking Myanmar, for a Myanmar which has insurgencies of its own then?
We must also understand before we go into this issue of our current problems with them and why we've developed a relationship in the manner we have and why we are choosing to open and keep our options open. We must understand that India and Myanmar share a lot of common history, and from 1800s onwards, when the Ahom Kingdom, it's the Anglo-Burmese War of 1800s. Until 1937, Burma was very much a part of our country. It's only then that the British decided to, and they gained independence in 1948. And then it became, it came behind their bamboo curtain, and they were like completely locked off, and the democracy and series of coups and kind of has disrupted the country's growth. And the army there has been in power for much of their independent history. And it's in 80s that we actually established, I think it was Rajiv Gandhi who first made a visit, means a real breakthrough in the recent past. Otherwise, though Nehru and the Burmese premier then had worked on the non-aligned movement and other things, but it's only in 87 and it's followed through by Narasimha Rao and previous. And we had a policy of give and take, you can actually call that. We've had a lot of large number of our militant bases. We, like you just brought out, we share about 1400 kilometers of boundary with the Myanmaris. It runs through, like in the south, it starts from Bangladesh, which again provides an entry into the other states of our country. Then you have Mizoram, then you have Manipur, Nagaland, and Arunachal Pradesh. And this terrain is pretty difficult to monitor because it's semi-hilly and mountainous, and it's highly wooded. And we have an agreement with them, that 32-kilometer you can cross over each other side, and those kind of, you had this trade agreement that existed. So it was very easy for people to mingle and come across. And so the cooperation of the Myanmaris, the Burmese junta, was very important for us to get a grip on our thing. And there's large amount of trade that is taking place also between those people in that area. Like in fact, in Manipur, the city of Moreh, which there's a road that has been built by us from Imphal, Moreh, beyond into Burma. The trade was about 100 crores. It's a huge amount of trade that takes place there. And the fact is that Myanmar has been very important, not only for the kind of support. We remember the cross-border raid that has taken place after the attack that took place in Manipur post the signing of the Naga Accord. And it's also important for us because Andaman Nicobar Islands can actually be monitored very closely by stationing, if you have presence of inimical countries there. You can actually monitor movements of our ships and all the activities that are taking place over our. So it's very important for us. The reason that, despite the world asking us to keep the Myanmar them under sanctions, India has always maintained that it's very easy to cut off a relationship, but to open channels and to be able to get some semblance of democracy in order. And we did raise a few statements about this, and there have been protests even in our sides. And like you brought out, there have been people trying to obtain asylum here, the CNA and others. So it's important for us not to completely blacklist or condemn them and get into the sanctions mode and cut off all ties. It's important militarily. It's important. There are ties. There have been age-old ties, historical ties. There are cultural ties. In fact, a large number of Indians made their wealth in even in Burma. In fact, one of our communist leaders, Mr. Prakash Karat's father, was and a large number of South Indians, Tamilians, and Malayalis also were part of Burma. So there is a lot of ties that you actually have. It's not like distant. Like for the Europeans, Myanmar is very much part of our fiber, and it's not very easy for us. And we have a disturbed Northeast. It's important for us to be able to keep them, keep in whether irrespective of the regime in power. I think it's very important that we continue to maintain the same level of engagements, and we have been providing a lot of assistance. And there is a large amount of assets also. We're building roads and the Kaladan and other things that are there. The highway that is going to go linking the Southeast Asia. It's all important. Burma is a very important. Myanmar is a very important part of our security calculus.
Absolutely. The reality is that while democracy is the way to go, and any move away from democracy is going to get the wrath of the international community, many countries in the region around Burma are staying away from making any rash statements, whether it's China, whether it's India, Cambodia, or anybody around there, because the reality also is that everybody has business to do with Myanmar. It may not be a very large country, but it's a large enough country, and it's at the cusp of all of these places where everybody is monitoring. With that reality in place, Manoj, explain to me, is this going to delay bringing democracy to Myanmar? Or do you think the rest of the world community will hold Myanmar to a high moral standard of democracy?
Look, that's a tricky question to answer. I mean, part of it is to do with the domestic dynamics that play out within Myanmar. From an international community standpoint, to me, it's really clear that the sort of heydays of international order, the idea that democratic institutions deliver and democracies therefore are inherently better off as a choice of governance, that idea has come under such severe challenge and such severe threat over the last decade and a half, that I don't think the moral argument today really works. That in the West, you're seeing that in our part of the world, those moral arguments are under a severe challenge. What's also working along with this, in parallel with this particular erosion of the moral superiority of the idea of democracy and the idea of individual liberty, is the idea that at the end of the day, in the international order, sovereignty is the fundamental principle, state sovereignty, and increasingly any sort of sanctions or intervention at the extreme end comes at extreme costs, and those are the kinds of costs that increasingly states are unwilling to bear. I mean, even sanctions today, I'm fairly certain if the Americans go back to sanctions on Myanmar, you're going to see the Chinese and the Russians push back against that strongly. You're going to see Beijing very clearly talk about the fact that state sovereignty is supreme principle of international affairs. You should not be violating that internal matter, and like they have already said, that you should be creating a conducive external environment for this matter to be resolved internally. So I don't really see international pressure work. That's the first point. What I do see, however, is an effort behind closed doors to negotiate between these parties that are at odds. The difference is that you're seeing a significant people's movement right now. There are protests on the streets. That's a positive sign for democracy. And it sounds absurd to say that in these times that we live in, but that is a positive sign for democracy when you see protests on the streets. At the same time, when you see, if you see the Chinese also interested in making sure, because the Chinese had found a modus vivendi to work with Aung San Suu Kyi, which in many ways was preferable to what they were doing with the army. And they would actually prefer in some ways to go back to working with the democratically elected government. So I think if you can sort of, behind closed doors, talk about a negotiated settlement in which essentially the army which is concerned, the army, sort of the leadership of the army which is concerned about their eroding political power, if you can broker some sort of a peace deal between those, sort of some sort of a power sharing deal, which again is complicated. I don't pretend to know the political dynamics within Myanmar well enough to say that that is even feasible. But that could be a way in which you can end up in a position where you can actually have some sort of a return to democratic processes, and that could then in the long term lead to institutionalization of those processes, and then perhaps democracy in its own sort of full-fledged, fully vibrant, colored format. So that's the way in which I can see. I don't see international pressure, sanctions, punitive action really having an impact.
Ambassador Trigunayat, do you agree with Manoj on his assessment of that there will not be enough international pressure, and Janta and the whole protests that are happening on the streets in Myanmar are going to be able to finally decide what the future is going to be?
Well, as you know that China definitely had a disproportionate influence on the military leadership there. That has, of course, been frittering away a little bit in the recent past, because nearly all the neighboring countries have been trying to work together, both with the democratic government as well as the army leadership there. And so you consider that as a model which worked well for last few years. But the reason for which I also think that there could be another angle to it. So now that all the civil servants, everybody has decided to really, in fact, for the banks, and central bank has refused the governors, and their ambassador to the UN has also sought asylum in the US. So, like the diplomats have been asked to leave. If that happens, that they do not have the instruments of governance, the army by itself cannot govern the country. And whereas the people are all rising very fast. So I think that the army is also realizing, and if there is a greater violence, of course, today I believe that there has been some violence, but if the greater violence comes, then the pressure, international pressure, will be far more stringent than what it is today. But at the same time, I think we have not talked about role of Russia. Russia is also extremely important, and I think that they have very close relationship at this time, and they could be a better and so more sobering influence on General Hlaing to really think about it. Secondly, one has to see what is the motivation for the general, basically. Whether his younger colleagues are going to stand with him, that is another thing one does not know now. It's very difficult to assess whether in this quest, and with the problems that are happening in the country, one is watching now the discontent at the popular level, whether the younger generation of the army will continue to support them. So there is a possibility that there could be a problem within the leadership, because General Lang's problem is that he is very much invested in the, and as you know, the army there also controls a large part of the industry, and General Lang himself is very much involved in these kind of various enterprises. And so his question was that what will happen to that if he goes, and that's why it went sour. And secondly, his problem was with the International Court of Justice. That he could be held to if he retires in July and he does not get anything. So he wanted to probably become the president or something so that he can be out of that. So there could be some kind of, and I agree with Manoj about his assessment, that it has to be a pressure from within that will build. But if the army really goes beyond a point, and I think that it'll be difficult, but we have to continue to work with ASEAN, with Japan, with some other countries in the region, so that we have both the channels open and assist them wherever necessary. The Myanmar is also suffering heavily from the COVID at the moment, apart from the economic stress that the country is going through, and now they have this democratic stress. So I believe that one has to work together, because from our point of view, it is really on the cusp of our neighborhood first and Act East policies, and it's an extremely important country. By being rash in some way, we cannot do that. And India's game is not project democracy as is that of the US or some other countries. in the way that they want the Westminster style of democracy to come in.
Sure, and you talked about Russia, Ambassador Trigunayat. Russia in itself is going through a crisis of its own with protesters out there on the streets. Well, will it come out and give its support to the military rule in Myanmar? Absolutely it would. And it's going to be difficult for the rest of the world to make Myanmar listen to it if Russia, China are not going alongside, because they are the ones who have a lot of influence in this area. Colonel P K Pillay, how do you see India playing this out, and how do you see India will be able to protect its northeast when it comes down to this whole challenge in Myanmar? Is there a challenge to look out for India at this moment?
Ambassador Trigunayat has answered the question. India is really not, out to impose a Westminster style of democracy in those regions. We don't believe in this farce of, disposing, enforcing leadership change, and we try to get what is best for all communities and all countries in with what we have going on. We don't attempt drastic alterations. In fact, we must just understand, even though America was a democracy and we were also a democracy in 71, there was a dictator committing a genocide in Bangladesh, East Pakistan, then just following the devastating impact of Cyclone Bola that left millions of Bangladesh, East Pakistanis homeless. And there was absolute, like Kissinger and Nixon and the Americans, just in the British and many countries in Europe stood by them. So this farce about like democracies are the one that we are upholding, I don't believe, and India's worked on what is good for the common interest and has minimized its interference in other countries, and it's done exceedingly well in protecting its own interests, and there has always been a kind of a give and take. And since we have our core interests, our interests are not merely security, it's also to cater for, like other states, like many other countries in the region, for them the primary interest lies in the military objectives about domination, about occupying territories, whereas for us the primary occupation is about uplifting millions of our own people and securing our own interests, and creating better communications, creating greater people to people contact, creating a greater viable economic partnership in the eastern regions and fringes of our country. And for that we need to have the cooperation of whoever's in whichever regimes are in power, and India has worked consistently towards maintaining its single-minded focus of uplifting its people, and it's done a great job from 1947 till date. And its impact can actually be seen in the neighborhood too, where it's a country, and many of our policies have actually seen countries in the region being uplifted by what India has done. And not only merely, even much before the world talked about responsibility to protect, India did that. A poor, famished, impoverished country living on dole from on aid had actually gone and liberated a country and created a new country. And today Bangladesh beats the parameters of East Pakistan, West Pakistan. And so India has worked towards creating better economic environment, better security environment. It's looked at the human security aspect of its relationship with the other people. It's never ever focused on the human, on the national, like core security issues. It's always looked at economic opportunities better, and it's never extracted its pound of flesh like other countries do in whatever it has delivered in terms of aid or assistance or cooperation mutually benefit. So I think India would continue the policy that was there since the 80s, which has taken a turn with. I think we would continue with our policy, and we would secure our interests, and we are quite capable of doing without damaging, the way. Like I've been in Iraq and Syria when I went with the Red Cross as a military advisor. I've seen what imposition of democracy in a country has actually, brought about. There's more poverty. They've gone back to the medieval ages. So I don't think India has that kind of a policy, and
Sure.
we would
I heard
benefit
you.
greatly.
I heard you. And what Colonel P K Pillay you're referring to, really, if I may, again, stretch that a bit, is what you're saying is India is not going to be imposing what it wants on the Myanmarese people or the state itself. It's going to be up to the people and what they want and how they want it, rather than India trying to determine how it should happen. And I think that's possibly a good way for India's non-aligned policy in the past. It obviously, it was involved with the Myanmaris as well as it created the non-aligned policy. And it said, each country is responsible for itself and its people are responsible for itself, unless and until obviously a genocide begins to happen, and then possibly other countries intervene. And until then, India is going to stay away and is going to guide them in the way it can and work with them in its neighborhood. Thank you, Colonel P K Pillay. Thank you, Ambassador Trigunayat. Thank you, Manoj, for joining me for this show. And I think what we have to understand is Myanmar has had this history of military leaders taking over. This time is no different. The military leadership has an extremely rough situation where it's involved in businesses, it's involved in figuring out how it's going to control, who's its, the relationships are going to be with, whether it's China, whether it's India. And that in itself creates a challenge. Never has one seen military dictators take a country to a new height to bring about egalitarianism. It's just not possible. It's just not the tenets of military dictatorships. So at Democracy News Live, we continue working on making sure that we raise the voice when we have to, when we see democracy under stress, when we see people's rights are being taken over. Thanks for watching. Good night and good luck.